if I could have the critical materials panel come to the stage, and I will introduce to you why we are having such a panel, critical materials, critical minerals, like Aaron's so introduced to us in such a fine way, are important for all manner of energy, the energy portfolio in the state of Wyoming. And there's quite a few cross-cutting issues that relate to it. And so we felt that having this kind of panel with this kind of audience would be a good service to the community. Our panel will be introduced by our moderator, who I will introduce to you now, and that is Bob Gregory. He's an associate research professional with the School of Energy Resources. He had a long career with the Wyoming State Geological Survey and now has a second career at SCR. He has experience in chemical analysis, mapping, critical minerals, uranium industry, and thank you, Bob, for moderating this panel.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much, Dr. Kazuma. If you've ever wondered what a tough act to follow is, what it looks like, you just saw it. So thanks very much to Dr. Campbell, especially for the introduction on critical minerals, what they are, why they're critical, things like that. So it makes our job a little easier since we're maybe running a few minutes behind. So just a tad of an introduction to myself. As John mentioned, I spent a little over 30 years at the State Geological Survey. Was fortunate enough to study pretty much everything in the survey that they do, aside from geologic hazards. So I spent time studying coal, oil and gas, industrial minerals, geology of uranium deposits and roll fronts, which we're going to touch on a little bit here in this discussion. And it did years of geological analysis, and I spent about 15 years as a uranium geologist. Right now, I'm honored and privileged to be working at the School of Energy Resources. I've spent the last couple years, 2.5 years, on the core CM projects, and the CM, of course, is critical minerals. And when we say critical minerals, we're also including the rare earth elements, because all the lanthanides are listed on the critical mineral list. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel members. Directly to my right is Mr. Scott Maxwell. He is, I have to remind myself, he's with Denbury Incorporated, and that's chief geoscientist there. And I'll let them introduce themselves and tell us a little more about what they do and why they find critical minerals so important in their roles. To his right is Joe Evers. Joe comes from correct me if I'm wrong, but it's American Rare Incorporated now. Wyoming Rare. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm sure you will. So apologize for that. To his right is Dr. Erin Phillips, my colleague at School of Energy Resources. She's the director of cross-cutting programs there, energy development, leadership, and career program. And to the far right is Ms. Ellen Polides. She's a PhD candidate working with Dr. Kazuma. So with that, how about we start with you, Scott?
So Nick, great to be here. So I'm Scott Maxwell, as was mentioned. I'm the chief geoscientist at Denbury, which is recently now a subsidiary of ExxonMobil. And my role there for the last 8 years has been working with our enhanced oil recovery and also with our building our sequestration business for CO2. And so the synergy to critical materials is now I joined the team as we were merging together at ExxonMobil with the LaBarge operations, right? Because there's a connection there between the CO2 produced at LaBarge and then also the helium that comes off of that. And then the activity that we're doing as Denbury. So it's great to be here. I'm also my degrees are in geology, obviously, as a chief geoscientist. But my wife reminded me to have a little bit of fortitude coming into town this week, because I know you guys are playing BYU, which is where I got my undergrad. So hopefully you guys don't hold that against me, but go Cougs.
Go Pokes.
My name's Joe Evers, and I'm also with a subsidiary. I'll throw you a little curveball. American Rare Earths is the parent company that kind of put together several different rare earth element mining prospects in the United States. And the project that I'm affiliated with under Wyoming Rare USA is Hallett Creek, that was kind of touched on earlier. We're just kind of in between Laramie and Wheatland, right on the Platte County, Albany County line. And we'll get into it a little bit more, but I was fortunate enough to grow up in Sheridan, Wyoming, around the industry, oil and gas, mining. And I came to the University of Wyoming with the goal to work in that industry. And I kind of did finance. I went to law school after that and did the Hub School, JDMA, which kind of gave me a good ability to blend the development world and the legal worlds. And so now leading up Wyoming Rare, very thankful to be here and appreciate the Wolds and School of Energy Resource for having us.
Thank you. I'm Erin Phillip, and I am the Director for Cross-Cutting Programs at the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. Up until a couple of months ago, I was the program manager for our critical minerals programs at SER. So I did my graduate work here at the University of Wyoming, and I am also currently an adjunct faculty member in that department. So at SER, we're very focused on looking at critical mineral potential in unconventional resources, specifically coal and coal byproduct. I'm a geologist by training, obviously, and I work with a stellar group of geologists at SER working to characterize those unconventional deposits across the state. We also have a number of projects going on there that address other aspects of the critical minerals supply chain. At the Center for Carbon Capture and Conversion, Trina Pfeiffer is building a group to look at rare earth element extraction. And we also work on topics that cut across the supply chain, like economics, social science, and legal topics. So I'll highlight here a couple of our exciting projects, but hopefully we'll talk about them a little bit more. Bob mentioned the CORE-CM projects. CORE-CM stands for Carbon Ore, Rare Earths, and Critical Minerals. We have two of those projects in the state, one of them in the Powder River Basin and one in the Greater Green River and Wind River Basins. Those phase one projects are just wrapping up, but they're very broad projects looking at the build out of those supply chains in Wyoming and the surrounding regions. And I'll also mention a project that we're working on with the National Energy Technology Laboratory to look at the feasibility of extracting rare earth elements from coal fly ash, which is a small pilot that's being stood up by the National Energy Technology Laboratory in Gillette. So I'm also very interested in workforce development and educational initiatives. So I find my job really exciting because it's kind of the intersection of applied geology and working with Wyoming energy communities.
Hi, I'm Ellen Pallades. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Wyoming in the Department of Geology and Geophysics. My advisor you heard from earlier is John Kazuba, and I have worked with both the School of Energy Resources and the Wold Foundation for funding on my projects. My dissertation is looking at metal mobilization in the subsurface as it applies to different energy transition technologies. So I'm looking at carbon storage and what metals are released during that, and that is a project with SER in the Powder River Basin. And I have a project looking at metal mobilization in shallow, low-temperature sedimentary basins, not that shallow, but low-temperature sedimentary basins, and I'm looking at the Bighorn Basin for that, and specifically oil that is sourced from the Phosphoria Formation. If you remember from the Aaron Campbell's presentation, they're looking at the Phosphoria Formation, and that also contains a lot of rare earths. So I'm interested in how rare earths are moving in both oil and water in these basins. So yeah, I've done 2 internships with national labs, so I can answer questions about that if students have those, and excited to be here.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Erin, if I could start with you, I guess this is kind of a general question, but can you tell us why it's so important to build a domestic rare earth element supply, and including other critical minerals?
Sure. Well, Dr. Campbell definitely touched on this in her talk, but as she said, these materials are essential for our national defense, for economic security, and they're also essential for many green energy technologies. And I think, as Dr. Campbell also highlighted, many of the critical minerals that are sourced today are sourced and processed in countries that do not necessarily have stringent environmental and human rights regulations. So I think that's another important point for building out domestic critical mineral supply chains. And would you like me to touch on Wyoming here too, or talk?
Yeah, I was just about to follow that up with the Wyoming. So yes, please continue.
So I think that Wyoming is a great place to build out this emerging industry for a number of reasons. We have this very strong energy infrastructure in place in the state, mining infrastructure. We have a workforce that's highly trained in these areas. People that are already working in mines and in the energy industry have a lot of skills that are transferable. And from a geological standpoint, it's very promising in Wyoming. As you'll hear, there are 2 world-class conventional rare earth element deposits in the state of Wyoming. And there's really kind of the groundwork has really been laid in the state of Wyoming to look at these conventional or these unconventional rare earth and critical mineral sources such as coal and coal byproducts. And I just would add that, I mean, we have such a vast coal resource in the state. So it's exciting to be looking at these alternative non-thermal uses for that resource.
Yeah, very well said. And I think it's really important to, as you touched on, diversify as much as possible. Look at all the possible resources where we can get these things. So thank you very much. Joe, as you mentioned before, you guys are working on the Red Mountain Pluton, Hallett Creek. I don't know what the best name for it is. What specific challenges do you think Wyoming faces compared to other states or nations in developing this kind of an industry, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think I'll turn it a little bit and say that the challenges we face kind of as a country that were just alluded to, Wyoming has a strategic advantage that kind of counteracts some of the other challenges. I think I'm kind of restating it here, but it comes down to what we've been talking about all day. I think Wyoming is uniquely situated because we have the people and the know-how. We have the infrastructure, which is a really key component that I think as Americans we take for granted every day, that we have tier 1 access to railroads, interstates, electricity, natural gas. All the types of things that you would need for an industrial processing are here and don't really have to be built out like you might see with projects in other places in the world. So I think those are some key things going for us. We also have the regulatory understanding and know-how, both on the industry side and with the state. I think Wyoming has an incredible resource in our state regulatory agencies and how their knowledge of the different natural resources plays into seeing things happen. So I think there's many examples of the state of Wyoming taking primacy from the federal government to administer regulations here in the state. And I think that really plays into why we believe, and I think it's pretty much a proven fact, that Wyoming is a tier 1 jurisdiction to develop. So we think being in Wyoming is a huge strategic advantage for our project. And then when you drill down on that a little bit more, we have a unique opportunity to develop the first phase of our project on state-owned minerals and state-owned surface, which gives us kind of a path to permitting that's realistic and that we're excited about here in Wyoming. So I think some of the challenges that we'll talk about in the future, Wyoming is really uniquely situated. And that's why I think you see 3 projects starting to come up, and we have some ability to start stacking and vertically integrating here in Wyoming.
Excellent. Very well said. And I agree. The environment here in Wyoming is well suited to this type of industry. Very pro minerals, very pro mining, very pro natural resources. And the folks at the DEQ, I know, at least with respect to the uranium industry, that list of tasks is very well. It's in good hands with the folks at the DEQ. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that as well. Got question about mining and extraction of critical minerals. Can you touch on how that can impact local communities and the environment in the positive ways?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think the best way to answer that is to talk about the LaBarge project, as it's been. And one of the things that I've learned over the last year, coming into ExxonMobil from Denbury is, LaBarge is just an incredible world-class asset. And ExxonMobil's belief is that we've got, it's 100+ year, asset that we have there to develop. And over the last 9 years, I've been working EOR, enhanced oil recovery, so bringing old oil fields back to life. And one of the really cool things about working old oil fields is to go back as we build our geologic models and do our simulation and we history match the whole production. You get to go and look at, what was happening with the field in 1940, when we were going through World War II and then the Korean War and Vietnam War and then into oil embargo and times of high oil price and times of low oil price. And what's really neat about thinking through that whole thing is the generations of local people, right, who were working in those oil fields. Some of them who generationally, had the family members have been working that field, through the entire time, right? It's just really neat to see. And so I think you have that opportunity here with getting large projects, or we've already seen this here, but example from LaBarge, right? If we're talking about 100 years of production from that field and facility, then you're talking about 100 years of local impact to the community, and also revenue for the state and revenue for the mineral owners and everyone involved. So I think in terms of stats for LaBarge, I think it employs something like 200 full-time employees, another 100+ contractors, and so it's something like $100 million annually in terms of the taxes and the salaries and the contributions locally, the sponsorships and the scholarships. And, and I'll say just the other really cool thing about coming into a big company is to see all the programs and everything else available that's available for communities. I'll give an example. I didn't say this in my introduction, but I actually worked for ExxonMobil to start my career, left, and now got pulled back in. But I was volunteering with the Cub Scouts down in Houston when I worked for ExxonMobil, and my boss came to me and said, "Hey, that we'll match your volunteer time, working for the Cub Scouts." And they actually, we were able to get money for that local Cub Scout troop, from ExxonMobil because I was volunteering my time there. And that's just a great example of how, you bring in a company with a lot of resources and it adds value to the local community, right? And beyond just the employment and everything else that comes along with that and the taxes. So there's just a great opportunity of getting more and more of these projects, going in the state of Wyoming. And then I think the other part of your question was around, environmental as well. And I'll say that, the great thing you can see from the LaBarge facility as well is the CO2 capture at that facility, right? So we've managed to create in the state of Wyoming, the largest CO2 capture facility, in the world in terms of the total volume of CO2 captured to date. So the plant captures something like, 6 to 7 million tons of CO2 per annum, right? Which is then sold for EOR projects and also sequestered. And so just being able to take something that is environmentally sensitive and be able to put it back for use in the state is just a wonderful thing. And I think also the proven track record that ExxonMobil and Denbury also had in the state of being able to work reliably, work safely, and keep these operations going for the economic benefit of everyone in the state. It's just incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. I agree. It's very important to stress these positive impacts on communities, and it's at the same time, I think it's important to make people aware that, for companies such as ExxonMobil or whoever, Wyoming Rare, they're highly motivated to take as good a care of the environment as possible, because if they don't, they're not going to be able to sustain their operations. So I think if anybody pays attention to environmental regulations and takes care of the environment, it's the companies that are most successful like this. A couple of questions about the resource, the helium resource out at LaBarge. Some general questions for people that might not know, and I knew at one point, but I can't remember. How big is a resource, annual production, things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we like to say, which I think is what Dr. Campbell said this morning, is the easiest way to think about it is it's 20% of the world's supply of helium, right? And which is just astounding, right? In terms of this year. Now you can go back and figure out what that is, and I don't have that number in front of me, right? Nor do I have in front of me the number for the total volume. We could go back and get that, but it's just an incredibly vast resource, right? That we have, and you think about 20% of the global supply coming from Wyoming, and then the other major suppliers coming from the Middle East and for Russia. I know we'll get into it probably, but just how incredibly important that is in terms of having that domestic supply, right, for the United States. It's just great.
Yeah, very much so. And as a geologist, I'm always curious as to how things get where they are. So if I'm understanding it right, from the other gases that are produced, helium is kind of left behind. Is that basically what happens?
Yeah, no. If we didn't try to extract it, yeah, it would definitely just float on out of there, right? But originally, this was a natural gas discovery, right? In terms of the accumulation. So in the reservoir, you have natural gas, you have helium, you have nitrogen, you have H2S, and so as those gases are produced from a fairly substantial depth, from something like 15,000 feet, high temperature, with a significant volume of H2S. As those are produced, they come to the facility, and then the helium is extracted through a cryogenic process, where it you cool the gases down, and then the helium eventually drops down into a liquid at something like I think it's negative 452 degrees Fahrenheit, and so now that's me describing the process as a geologist. So I apologize to any facility engineers in the room, right? But that's my crude understanding of how that works. But you extract the helium, and then you're able to then it's in a liquefied form that's much more easily transportable, right? And off to our industrial source.
Yeah. Okay.
That's true.
And another question I imagine a lot of people have: what are its primary applications aside from allowing us to sing like chipmunks?
Yeah, I almost I thought about bringing a balloon and answering your first question, about the helium, but yeah, a lot of us think about lifting the lifting gas potential of helium, right? Which is what we typically see, but that's actually a very, very small use of helium. The more important uses of helium are just really interesting when you start learning about them. So helium is used both to cool things because of its low temperature as a liquid, and then also as an agent to clean things, or to keep things pure. So a great example of this is in the computer chip industry. As you're creating semiconducting chips, they pass helium through the process to lift out the dust and the other gases to avoid damage to those critical components that they're creating in the facilities. Another example, similar use is in the space exploration business. So in terms of the fuel lines and the fuel tanks, you pass helium through those components to allow for a very pure fuel to be stored in those tanks, which, as we all have seen, right, it's incredibly important that you get those fuel mixtures right in terms of the safety of our astronauts and the safety of the equipment being sent up into space. And then another really interesting use of helium is if any of you have had the unfortunate experience of having an MRI, which I have on several occasions, and you hear that large thumping machine. So those are the magnets sitting in liquid helium, right? So just to terrify you a little more of being in that enclosed tube, you're surrounded by liquid at negative 452 degrees as well, right? So those magnets get very hot, and they have to keep them cool in the MRI machine, and so that's another really important use of helium. And then of course there's uses in welding and diving and other, and I think in lab applications too, right, for cooling and for purifying in terms of lab processes. So a lot of demand in terms of where you might not expect it, and a lot of demand in some pretty critical industries in the United States.
Yeah, very good. I wasn't aware of pretty much all of that. So yeah, thank you very much. Very cool. No pun intended. I'd like to ask Ellen a little bit more about what she's doing. You mentioned some of the fluid movements and metal transport. Reminds me of roll front environments where you're moving mobile elements like uranium, vanadium through through porous media, very porous rocks, permeable rocks. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned in terms of other metals, critical metals that might occur in the areas that you've studied?
Yeah, definitely. So School of Energy Resources, I think along with Idaho National Lab a couple years ago, put out a report looking at mobilization of rare earth elements in produced waters and geothermal waters. And most of that survey, and it was multiple basins across the country, showed fairly low concentrations of these rare earth elements in the waters. And I came across that and also came across some other studies looking at oil and rare earth elements in the hydrocarbons, the crude oil themselves. And sometimes the rare earth elements are in higher concentrations in the oil. So I wanted to see if, in the case of the Phosphoria Formation, which we know has rare earth elements in it, it has produced a large amount of oil and it sits in all of these basins in Wyoming. Does that oil carry more rare earth elements than the water? And the answer is yes. It does carry about, I think, at highest, like 100 times more rare earth elements than the water. But those are all in very low concentrations. But then you think about the volumes of the oil that has been produced from these formations. From the Phosphoria Formation, it's about 225 billion barrels is projected to have been generated. And that migrated around 400 kilometers to the east of Idaho, moving all the way to the Powder River Basin in some cases. So just looking at what that means for the distribution of the rare earth elements that are coming from the Phosphoria Formation into these basins, and as well as I did look at other elements and critical materials like uranium and vanadium, and looking at how those could be transported and in what environments. When the oil is generated, it's obviously hotter than when it's sitting in the reservoirs themselves. So that's part of my research as well, looking at those temperature differences and the differences in mobility between those elements in the water and the oil, and how might they be carried and how might we be able to find them and kind of access those.
Great, thank you. Along those lines, during the course of your studies, do you think you come across areas where you may have discovered something or realized something that you weren't anticipating that, maybe for the benefit of some of the students here, that might be areas where they might pursue sort of additional future work that might be warranted?
Definitely. I mean, I only sampled from 3 fields in the Bighorn Basin, and there is Phosphoria sourced oil in the Wind River Basin, the Greater Green River Basin, and the Powder River Basin. So if somebody wanted to piggyback and look at, how far do these metals go? How do they vary in different types of traps, whether that be like structural or just some kind of stratigraphic trap? There's definitely room for that. And I would love to talk to anybody who wants to piggyback off of that. But there are so many critical mineral type projects that can happen if you go over and knock on the door at SCR. I've had great success working with them. And also, Wyoming is just a great place to do geology, to do critical mineral resources, because they have so much data, so many maps from the WSGS, the Earth MRI data. There are geochemical analyses that are publicly available everywhere. There's so much public land to access. There's so many industry partners that are really excited to work with students. So it's really the sky's the limit here, feels like.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I think I speak for everybody at SCR when I say we absolutely love working with the students, and it's wonderful. So so one more question, and I think you kind of clued me to it. How did you approach DOE applications for the programs that allowed you to complete your work at a national lab?
There are a lot of opportunities here. I know we've had like a national labs day in the past that the School of Energy Resources has helped with, and they brought in a lot of national lab scientists and faculty, and they're very easy to approach in person or over email, and you just find somebody who's doing a project that you're interested in, email them. You can cold email, that's fine. And you can also lean on the School of Energy Resources for those connections. And there are so many DOE programs that you can apply to. So I had an internship my first year as a master's student through the Mickey Leland Energy Fellowship through the Fossil Energy Carbon Management Office. And I also did a visiting researcher stint that I just got from through the SCGSR program, which is the Office of Science Graduate Research Program. So there are a lot of different programs. Go on their website, scroll through them, and they're just trying to get students in. And that often leads to other opportunities as well, like employment at a national lab if that's what you're interested in. So I highly encourage anybody to take advantage of that.
Awesome. Thank you, Ellen. Yes, we definitely need students. So if you take away nothing else, take away that. So, Joe, let me ask you a little bit about more about the project you're working on. Aaron talked about unconventional resources, and obviously your project is more of a conventional. Can you talk about some of the mining techniques you might employ and some of the various things you have to deal with that a lot of people might not be aware of?
I will give it my best as a non-geologist, but the interesting thing about this prospect, Halleck Creek, I think it's important that we're in Laramie, and originally some of the ideas that were developed that said there's rare earth element mineralization in this geologic area, the Red Mountain Pluton, were developed right here at the University of Wyoming by two geologists unrelated named Frost. So I think that was in the mid-90s, and then we've kind of evolved forward in the private industry to really kind of exploring what that looks like. So that's kind of where we are now with defining what that resource looks like across our leasehold area, if you will. Mining wise, we have a very homogeneous geologic resource. So it's pretty much right at the surface. If you and I went out there and we grabbed a rock, it's the same rock that you would find at depth. And as we drill, we've gone as deep as 300 meters and have not found the bottom of that Pluton at this point. So from a mining perspective, it's simple. Even I can wrap my head around it. It's very similar to like what you would see at other surface type mining operations, quarry. I think another interesting thing, especially for me growing up in Sheridan, when I think of mining, I think of coal mining in the Powder River Basin, which is an amazing example of what we can do in industry. But those are huge footprints, and the resource is different in rare earth elements, and specifically our location where we have that Cowboy State mine that I was talking about, which is fully on state of Wyoming surface and minerals. The ultimate footprint on that is probably 200 acres, which is hard to wrap your head around, but basically like a pinprick inside of the Powder River Basin coal mine, which is something that we think might have 20 years of potential life or more. We're still trying to figure that out, but that's the type of scale that you can get from a smaller footprint. So that's a little bit on the mining. Without monopolizing the time, the most interesting and complex aspect of this project, I think, is the metallurgy. That's something that is the most paramount to whether these rare earth elements can be produced economically. And we're talking a lot about rare earth elements, and I think I take certain things for granted, but rare earth elements aren't really that rare. It's kind of a misnomer. What's rare is when you find them in an economic quality. So if you went out and dug in your backyard, we'd all probably find some amount of de minimis rare earth elements. But I think, as you can see, we talk about these three different projects that are ongoing in the state of Wyoming. That's pretty fantastic. Like Courtwold said, it's all about the rock, and we have it here. And I think that gives us a lot of opportunities to start stacking other facets of the downstream processing here in the state, which is something that would be kind of unique because historically we haven't quite grabbed that flame in the past. We always export things, which is great. We do it very well, but this is a unique opportunity in time with kind of a nascent industry that's developing here in Wyoming.
Yeah, great. Yes, as Mr. Wold mentioned, it's capitalism drives where things actually happen, how they're most economically produced, refined, and so on. But I think everybody understands that it's important to to get as strong a foothold on our processes here domestically as possible. Aaron, I have a question for you. As opposed to the conventional methods that we heard from Joe, unconventional sources that we're dealing with course EM projects. How do you see these resources being developed in light of the conventional resources being developed from rare earth elements, or rare element resources, Wyoming rare, and so on?
Sure. So I think it's essential that the conventional type deposits and the unconventional type deposits are developed simultaneously. I think that there's a real regional economic advantage to that. Obviously, the processing techniques that take place for different types of feedstocks will be very different. But a lot of the things that go into building out those industries overlap, like the transportation, like the infrastructure, the workforce who will be working in these areas. So I think that there's a real opportunity there. If we were to be able to build a technology center that could accommodate multiple types of critical mineral feedstocks, I mean, I think that's a real opportunity to think about. And we've talked about the supply chain a little bit, but the rare earth element supply chain is quite complex. So as a geologist, I'm focused kind of on the top part of the supply chain, looking at characterization. But the middle part of the supply chain involves multiple steps of separation and purification. And then there's also downstream manufacturing. So in Wyoming, we have always been pretty focused on that upstream part of the supply chain in the energy and mining industries. So I think now is the time to really think about that full supply chain as we build that out. And that includes both the conventional and unconventional type deposits.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody would agree that diversity is is good in this type of situation and in everywhere, really. So thank you very much for that. I don't know for sure if any of you have any particular comments you'd like to add at this point. I got some other questions here, but feel free to touch on anything you feel would be important to add at this point that I might not have gotten around to asking about. So.
Well, given the setting, if you'll indulge me, I'd just like to talk about, since we have the unique opportunity of students being here, if they can saddle up for a little advice. But I think this room is really unique. This conference is very unique because it marries Wyoming-focused business people, academics, regulators, politicians. And I think as a student, it's hard to appreciate what that means. I certainly couldn't when I was a student here, but I think without a doubt, any dreams that you have or any career aspirations that you have, there's somebody in this room today that can help you open a door and get to the next step. Every opportunity I've had in my career the door has been opened by a UW alum, and they're always happy to do so. I think in that regard, all of us have a tie to this university, a tie to this state, and we owe it to ride for the brand in that scenario. And I see a group here, we all have steamboats on our chest, and that means something. And people outside of here know that it means something. It means hard work. It means that you have ingenuity, and everybody in this room, I think, shares that. So don't forget that when you get out of here. And lastly, I think it's hard to wrap your head around as a student, but kind of pay it forward. I think I went to Wyoming Public School from kindergarten all the way through law school. So I feel like I owe a debt back to the state because of that education that was subsidized. And so I think about it in terms of severance taxes and stuff. And everybody in here is working on something that brings it back to the state. But certainly try to pay it forward and lean on that University of Wyoming network when you get out, and come talk to folks during today.
Very well said. And I agree. When I was a student, I didn't really see how all the puzzle pieces fit together. So that's excellent advice. So thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think one of the things for the geologists and the geoscientists is, we talk about, oil and gas, and we talk about CCUS, and we talk about, the helium production. And you think about these things as different industries, but really, the rocks are the rocks, which we've said a few times today, right? And so I've been, when I switched from conventional oil and gas to doing enhanced oil recovery, with CO2 and then CO2 sequestration, I think the thing that I found that was just great was those skills were all very portable, right? That it wasn't like I had to, as a geoscientist, I didn't have to learn a whole lot of new skills, going from those different streams of, different products of production. Right now, I haven't tried my hand at mining. I think there might be a little bit more there, and that I've forgotten a lot from economic geology back in college. But I, take advantage of the opportunity to just get into the industry, right? Wherever, and build your networks and take advantage of the opportunities that you have. And you're going to find a long and satisfying career as these industries continue to build.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, on that note, I would add a couple of things. I mentioned the supply chain earlier, but there's really opportunities for work and employment all the way across the supply chain. It's not just technical work, geologists and engineers. There's economics that come into it, law, social science is hugely important. And we at SER have had the privilege of working with a number of graduate students on these projects. Ellen, Dr. Kazuba's other student, Sophie Stewart, did some excellent work on the rare earth element occurrence in Powder River Basin coal seams. So there's lots of opportunities out there to work on these Department of Energy funded projects. And lastly, I would just say it's always so much fun to go out across the state and just connect with the alumni network in the state and everybody with connections to UW. It really makes working on these projects rewarding.
Thanks, Aaron. We allotted some time for questions from folks in the audience, if we have any of those. Thank you, John.
For folks, while we're working on these questions, for folks who want to run questions on up, just raise your question up, and the student runners, there's a student runner over there, there's one back there, there's one in the back, one over on the right, one in the back, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 very fine students who work with me who volunteered to run up these questions here for the panel today.
Awesome.
Run them up.
Thank you, John. Good plan. Okay, so here's one for Ellen. What advice do you have for students who want to pursue an unconventional science project?
I think definitely reaching out to the School of Energy Resources because they do that so well. With the coals, and especially you could go talk to Sophie Stewart at her poster later. She works on unconventional resources, like we said. And I think that is really, those are the fun science projects, there are a lot of good hard rock projects, but I'm more of a sedimentary gal myself. And I think that those unconventional resources are very interesting scientifically. You can pull out a great master's or PhD chapter looking at those processes. How are those critical minerals ending up in these less conventional deposits? How can we target that, especially in a place like Wyoming where there are just mountains of sedimentary rocks everywhere? So I think just kind of start asking those scientific questions and it'll start flowing after that.
So this is a great question. So what lessons about co-production of natural gas helium can be applied to potential co-production of oil and gas with critical minerals? And I'll say I don't know that I have the background to answer that particularly, but I think I do have the broader industry to say this is an incredibly important question, because as a geoscientist, it's really easy to go find, well, not easy, but we can go find the accumulations, we can go find the resources. And what you really need is, in addition to some really excited exploration geologists, right, with a lot of enthusiasm, is you need really good engineers, right? You need really good facility engineering, reservoir engineering, because the devil's in the details, right? So, in terms of producing multiple streams at once, there's a lot that can go wrong in terms of getting the right pressure at the right points of your facility to not get deposition, for example, of sulfur, right, from your H2S, precipitating out inside of your facility. So I think it's a really important question, because it highlights the need for strong technical basis and multidisciplinary teams when you're developing these assets to really think about not just how do we get this onto the ground, but then how do we process this and how does it connect to the subsurface? What's going to happen in the future to the subsurface? Building strong geologic models, strong simulation models that are coupled in with the production and then the facilities to be able to avoid, some of these problems that will come around when you have multiple different components in the same gas stream.
Great. Thanks, Scott. A couple other questions. Here's one for Joe. It's a legal question, it looks like. What's the path for regulatory primacy for critical minerals?
This is not legal advice. Just kidding. I think we kind of already hit on it. Dr. Campbell showed really great visuals that uranium and thorium are often co-located with rare earth elements. So the state of Wyoming and the Department of Environmental Quality have moved to take primacy over the regulatory regime associated with those elements from the National Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and I probably mashed up the alphabet there a little bit. But why is that important to the state of Wyoming? Because now you're dealing with regulators in the state, in Cheyenne. The disconnect between Washington, D.C. and what works in Wyoming is not as present. So I think that's a huge step that's specific to the critical minerals and rare earth elements. And the rest I kind of already talked about. I think the regulatory regime in the state of Wyoming is something like businesses crave certainty. And we're always playing ping pong on the federal level, but in the state of Wyoming, the rules are defined. You know what you have to do, and you can go do them and work collaboratively to achieve the project goals that ultimately benefit the state.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, it seems to be a pretty efficient process. As slow as it is, it's efficient, and it's very important to get all the steps in. We got a lot of questions here. I like this one. And this could be for anybody. What efforts are being made to increase recycling of critical minerals? Does anybody know much about that? Because I honestly don't.
I'll take a stab at that, and then if anybody has anything to add, there are efforts ongoing for recycling of critical minerals. We are not working on those at the School of Energy Resources. I think that's a really important point. That needs to be part of the equation, and we are not recycling enough of these end-use products yet to recycle enough of those to meet our critical mineral needs at this point by any means. We'll see what that looks like in the future, but I think that needs to be part of the equation. We need to think about, e-waste, how that fits into our critical minerals budget, and kind of include that in our development of these unconventional and conventional deposits. And I would also add that there's also a large emphasis on looking at critical minerals in waste streams. So that's another important part of the equation. Can we use existing waste streams like coal ash and pull rare earth elements from those and process those in an efficient way to, again, kind of add to that equation and contribute to what we need for our critical minerals budget.
Okay.
Just to add something that we kind of alluded to earlier, but I think it's really important, especially in the context of this specific question. So China essentially has a monopoly over these elements and materials. So they have about 90% of the global supply comes in or out of China. The United States has one producing mine. We're working very feverishly to get the processing capacity moved domestically, but domestic supply is important. And whether that comes from traditional mining or recycling, we're solving for 90%. We have so much ground that we need to make up. We have to get it from everywhere. And I think it's wise that we're looking at every different avenue to do so. But just to put a little data point in there, that's how big the question is. That's what we're trying to solve for.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. And that kind of touches on some of the research that Aaron and I have worked on at SER. So here's another one for Aaron. And I forgot to mention this, and I apologize. You're headed to Norway soon. Can you talk more about that and what you'll be doing there?
Yeah, sure. I have the honor of being a Fulbright scholar to Norway in 2025. So I will be studying critical minerals supply chains in Norway. My host institution is the Norwegian Research Center, which is an entity very similar to SER. So I'm really excited about it. I'm going to be looking at parallels between Norway and Wyoming and how they're building out their critical minerals supply chains. And I'm also hoping to lay the framework for an exchange between the University of Wyoming and that group for students and hopefully staff and faculty. So there's lots of opportunities out there within Wyoming and beyond Wyoming. So thanks.
Awesome. Very exciting. I'll see if I can get this question right. And if not, whoever wrote it, please correct me. But it's for Ellen, and it's from Joey. AEC, I don't think that's Atomic Energy Commission, but I don't know. I honestly don't. So is there a relation between rare earth elements to source rocks, chemistry, organic or inorganic, between that and a relationship between that and the phosphoria occurrences, or is it coincidental, or do you know?
So there is a uranium vanadium deposit. There are a couple deposits in the Pryor Mountains and the Little Mountain mining district that are on the margin of the Bighorn Basin. And part of why I chose the Phosphoria Formation and this project in general is because there was a study that fingerprinted some of the bitumen, the organic matter that was in the uranium vanadium deposit. They looked at the rare earth element signatures in that bitumen, and then they looked at the rare earth element signature in the phosphoria rock, the organic rich layers of that, and they saw that those correlated. So if you're looking at a rare earth element pattern, you have concentration usually normalized on the y-axis, and then you have all of the rare earth elements on the x-axis, and it makes, some kind of shape. And when you plot them together, and if you want to correlate sources, the fingerprinting is looking at the shapes of those patterns. And in this publication, they looked at source, sink, and they saw that there was a correlation. So I wanted to see in the middle if there was that kind of correlation. And we don't see that strong of a signature actually in the oils themselves, but we know that that organic matter had to have come from somewhere. So kind of what happened in between, how it might have fractionated is part of the question that I'm trying to answer.
Okay, so don't drop the mic just yet. So there's another question for you. We got 4 more questions, and hopefully we can get them all in. So maybe we'll just like a lightning round here. Do you see prospects in the geologic storage of hydrogen as a research area?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a huge research area. So the Department of Energy is actively funding projects for that. I'm pretty sure my advisor is funding a student right now to look at hydrogen storage. And looking at geologic hydrogen is even better, trying to find those sources of hydrogen that we can pull from. It's not my area of expertise, but it's absolutely critical, and there should be more projects for it.
Terrific. Okay, so questions for anyone. Are we on track to meet the demand for critical minerals? And if not, what needs to be done to meet that demand? Anybody?
Yeah, I think we touched on it, right? I don't think we're on track. That's my personal opinion. I think the data backs that up. We're doing a lot as a nation and an industry to try to solve for that. Obviously, because I'm working on a project in the state of Wyoming, I'm a little bit more keen on the domestic source of the material rather than friend shoring that. I think we need to reshore that back to the United States. And it's happening. But there's a little bit of, like, in my perception, a little bit of a chicken and an egg when you have a huge question around processing and then a huge question around supply. And I think we're working to solve both, and we're working to solve both on the projects that we've been talking about in the state of Wyoming, which is super unique. But short answer, no. But I do think a ton of good work is being done on it across the nation.
Yeah, agreed and well said. Okay. For anyone, what role do the community colleges and career tech schools, like trade schools, play in meeting industry demands?
I think they're absolutely essential in these projects. We've worked closely with Gillette College on the Powder River Basin Symposium project, not only to help us identify what programs are in place that could help build out this workforce and where there are gaps, but I think that community colleges are just really that connection to the community. And so we have some really great partners with community colleges across the state, and plan to continue to engage with them as we go.
Agreed. Yeah, they're amazing. I've got a degree from Casper College, so I fully agree with that. Okay, last question for anybody, and it's probably maybe too long to get into, but what do you anticipate the regulatory process looking like?
I can speak to what we're working on as it relates to rare earth elements. So I mentioned that we have our prospect is on state lands, surface and mineral. So that puts us in the state regulatory pathway. For me and my background, I think that's incredibly exciting. I think it's a huge strategic advantage. It's a strategic advantage for the state and our project. That gives us a streamlined pathway to a potential permit on the mining side. We've been talking a lot about the processing. That requires a second type of permit, also from the Department of Environmental Quality through the Industrial Siting Council. So they're kind of bifurcated. And then if you want to stack it on top of that, if you move on to lands with a federal nexus, you're going to have the federal NEPA process, and I'll let you, when your crystal ball, decide when that will sort
Very much. Okay, thank you. I think we're right up against our time limit, so lest we cut into people's lunchtime, and especially Governor Gordon's time. Let me thank all of you, first of all, and thank all the members of the audience. Very special thanks to the Wold family, to SER, to Dr. Campbell, WSGS. I don't think I forgot anybody, but none of this would be possible, and it's a real honor to be here, and thank you very much to everybody.